On the morning of March 4th, 2022, emergency responders were called to a luxury home near Park City, Utah. A 39-year-old husband and father of 3 had been found unresponsive in his bedroom. His name was Kouri Richins. The person who made the frantic 911 call was his wife, Kouri Richins. At first, the case appeared to be a heartbreaking family tragedy. A healthy husband had gone to bed and never woke up. His wife was devastated. His children had lost their father. Friends and neighbors expressed shock. Nothing about the scene immediately suggested violence. There were no signs of forced entry. No struggle. No obvious wounds. No blood. No evidence of an intruder. Just a husband dead in his own home. But within months, investigators would begin uncovering a story so disturbing that it would capture national attention across the United States. Because prosecutors would eventually argue that Kouri Richins had not died suddenly. Mai had been murdered, and the person responsible, they claimed, was the woman who had shared his home, raised children with him, and publicly mourned his death. His wife, Kouri Richins. What followed would become one of the most shocking murder cases in recent American history. A case involving fentanyl, financial troubles, insurance money, a failed murder attempt, and a children's book written by a widow who prosecutors claimed had secretly poisoned her husband. This is the story of the death of Kouri Richins, and the investigation that led detectives directly into the heart of his own family. Kouri Richins was not a man known for taking risks with drugs. Friends described him as responsible, hard-working, and deeply involved in the lives of his children. He worked in construction and property development and had built a successful career. Those who knew him said he cared deeply about providing for his family. On the surface, the Richins family appeared successful. They owned property. They had money. They lived in a desirable area. From the outside, they looked like a family that had achieved the American dream. But appearances can be deceptive. As investigators dug deeper into the months leading up to Kouri's death, they discovered signs that all was not well behind closed doors. The marriage was under pressure. Money had become a source of conflict. Trust was beginning to disappear. And according to prosecutors, that growing tension would eventually provide the motive for murder. The first major clue came from the autopsy. Medical examiners discovered that Kouri had died from a fentanyl overdose. Fentanyl is one of the most powerful synthetic opioids in the world. Even a tiny amount can be fatal. It is many times stronger than heroin and morphine. A small dose can stop breathing within minutes. The discovery immediately raised serious questions. Why would a healthy businessman suddenly have fentanyl in his system? Kouri had no history of fentanyl abuse, no known addiction, no obvious reason to be using the drug. Investigators began searching for answers, and the deeper they looked, the more suspicious the circumstances became. The question was simple. How had fentanyl entered Kouri Richins' body? At first, detectives considered every possibility. Could he have taken it voluntarily? Could someone have supplied it to him? Could it have been accidental? But as they continued their investigation, another alarming piece of information emerged. Kouri may have survived an earlier poisoning attempt, and that discovery changed everything. Several weeks before Kouri died, something strange had happened during Valentine's Day. According to evidence later presented in court, Kouri became violently ill after eating a sandwich. His condition deteriorated rapidly. He developed severe symptoms. At one point, he reportedly required emergency medical treatment. The episode was serious enough to alarm those around him. At the time, no one suspected it was connected to a murder investigation. It appeared to be a medical emergency, an isolated event, something unfortunate but explainable. But after Kouri's death, investigators revisited the incident. What they found would become one of the most powerful parts of the prosecution's case. According to prosecutors, fentanyl had been involved in the Valentine's Day incident as well. If true, it meant Kouri had not been targeted once. He had been targeted twice. The significance of that allegation cannot be overstated. A single poisoning might be explained away. 2 poisonings aimed at the same person within weeks of each other are much harder to dismiss, especially when the victim ends up dead. Investigators now had a possible timeline. A failed attempt, followed by a successful one, and that timeline pointed them towards someone very close to Kouri, his wife. While detectives were examining Kouri's death, they were also investigating the financial state of the Richins family. This would become a crucial part of the case. On the surface, Kouri Richins appeared successful. She worked in real estate. She bought and sold properties. She projected confidence and ambition. But prosecutors would later argue that her financial situation was far more complicated than it appeared. According to court records, she had accumulated substantial debt through various property ventures. Millions of dollars were potentially at stake. At the same time, investigators learned that Eric had become increasingly concerned about financial decisions being made by his wife. Their marriage was no longer built on complete trust. There were disagreements, questions about money, questions about business transactions, questions about future plans. According to evidence presented during the trial, Eric had begun taking steps to protect his assets. For prosecutors, this detail was important because it suggested Eric was becoming harder to control financially. If he remained alive, he retained authority over significant assets. If he died, the financial landscape changed dramatically. That possibility would become central to the prosecution's theory. A's investigators examined insurance records, business dealings, and financial documents. They began building a picture of a possible motive. Money, not anger. Not revenge, not a crime committed in the heat of the moment, but a calculated decision motivated by financial gain. Detectives then turned their attention to electronic evidence, phones, messages, communications, contacts. According to prosecutors, this evidence revealed attempts to obtain fentanyl. Investigators traced connections between Kouri and individuals who could allegedly provide illegal drugs. Witness statements would later become critical. One particular witness would tell authorities that Kouri had sought fentanyl before Eric's death. Even more damaging was the allegation that after the Valentine's Day incident failed to kill Eric, she attempted to obtain stronger drugs. If true, it painted a chilling picture. Not a spontaneous act, but persistence, planning, a willingness to try again after failure. The prosecution would later emphasize this point repeatedly, because it transformed the case from a possible poisoning into an alleged campaign of murder. Then came the final night, March 3, 2020, the last evening of Eric Richins' life. According to Kouri's account, the evening was normal. The family was at home. Nothing seemed unusual. At some point, she prepared a Moscow Mule cocktail for her husband. Moscow Mule is a popular drink made with vodka, ginger beer, and lime. Millions of people drink it every year. On the surface, there was nothing suspicious about it. According to prosecutors, however, that drink became the murder weapon. They alleged that fentanyl had been mixed into the cocktail. Eric drank it, trusting the person who handed it to him, trusting the woman he had married, trusting the mother of his children. And according to the prosecution's case, that trust would cost him his life. As the fentanyl entered his system, Eric would have become increasingly incapacitated. His breathing would slow, his awareness would fade, his ability to seek help would disappear. Eventually, his body could no longer fight the effects of the drug. By morning, he was dead. There was no dramatic confrontation, no attack, no visible violence, just silence. The silence of a man dying in his own bedroom while those around him slept, or claimed to sleep. When emergency services arrived the following morning, the story initially seemed straightforward. A tragic overdose, a grieving wife, a devastated family, But investigators soon noticed something that often appears in major homicide cases. The facts did not fit the story. Eric had no reason to possess fentanyl, no known history of using it, no evidence suggesting he voluntarily consumed a lethal quantity. And as detectives examined the timeline more carefully, the gaps began to grow larger. Questions multiplied. Where did the fentanyl come from? Why had Eric suffered a suspicious medical emergency weeks earlier? Why were there concerns about finances? Why were investigators finding evidence suggesting attempts to obtain illegal drugs? Piece by piece, the case began taking shape. And before long, detectives would uncover a development that transformed this investigation into a national sensation. Because after Eric's death, Kouri Richins did something that would later shock millions of people. She wrote a children's book, a book about helping children cope with the loss of a father. And as investigators closed in, that book would become one of the most haunting details in the entire case. The publication of a children's book should have been a symbol of healing. Instead, it became one of the most disturbing details in an already shocking murder investigation. Only months after Eric Richins' death, Kouri Richins appeared in television interviews and public events promoting a book called Are You With Me? The story was aimed at children struggling with the loss of a parent. It focused on grief, memory, love, and the belief that a father who has died can still remain present in the hearts of his children. For many people, the book was touching. It appeared to be the work of a grieving widow trying to help her sons cope with unimaginable loss. The public saw a mother attempting to guide her children through tragedy. Few could have imagined that behind the scenes, detectives were building a case that painted a completely different picture. A's media appearances continued. Investigators continued their work. They reviewed financial records, insurance policies, property transactions, phone data, witness statements, and slowly they began assembling what prosecutors would later describe as a calculated murder plot driven by financial desperation. One of the most important questions was simple: who benefited from Eric's death? The answer led investigators directly into the Richins family's finances. According to prosecutors, Kouri was facing significant financial pressure. Her real estate ventures had become increasingly risky. Debt was growing. Projects were struggling. Money was becoming harder to find. At the same time, Eric controlled substantial assets. I was reportedly becoming concerned about financial decisions being made without his approval. Evidence suggested he was taking steps to protect family finances and limit his wife's access to certain assets. For prosecutors, this detail was critical because it suggested a growing conflict between husband and wife, not necessarily a conflict visible to friends and neighbors, but one that existed beneath the surface, a conflict involving money, control, and the future. Investigators also examined insurance policies connected to Eric. Court documents would later reveal allegations involving insurance fraud and forged paperwork. These allegations became additional charges during the criminal case. Prosecutors argued that financial gain was not simply a possible motive. It was the central motive. The theory was straightforward. If Eric remained alive, financial problems continued. If Eric died, millions of dollars could potentially become accessible. The prosecution would later tell jurors that greed had become more important than loyalty, marriage, or family. While financial investigators worked through records and transactions, detectives focused on another crucial area: the source of the fentanyl. According to prosecutors, witness testimony connected Kouri to individuals capable of obtaining illegal drugs. One witness became particularly important. Investigators alleged that Kouri had actively sought fentanyl before Eric's death. They further alleged that after the Valentine's Day poisoning failed, she sought stronger drugs. The prosecution argued that this demonstrated intent, not confusion, not accident, not recklessness. Intent. According to their theory, Eric's survival after the first poisoning attempt did not cause Kouri to abandon her plan. It caused her to refine it. 17 days later, Eric was dead. That timeline would become one of the most damaging elements of the case because it suggested persistence, planning, determination. The idea that someone had been given an opportunity to stop and instead chose to continue. As the investigation expanded, detectives found themselves confronting a difficult reality. Many of the most important moments had occurred inside the privacy of a family home. There were no surveillance cameras documenting the final drink, no eyewitnesses observing fentanyl being added, no recording of the alleged poisoning itself. This gave the defense an opportunity. From the beginning, Kouri Richins maintained her innocence. Her lawyers argued that prosecutors were relying heavily on circumstantial evidence. They pointed out that nobody had actually witnessed Eric being poisoned. They challenged witness credibility. They questioned investigative conclusions. They argued that the state's case was built on assumptions rather than certainty. In any major criminal trial, the defense only needs to create reasonable doubt. The prosecution must prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. That difference is enormous. And throughout the trial, the defense attempted to convince jurors that prosecutors could not bridge that gap. The courtroom battle that followed would last for weeks. Jurors heard testimony from investigators, medical experts, financial specialists, witnesses connected to the alleged drug transactions. They listened to discussions about fentanyl toxicity, property debt, insurance paperwork, phone records, financial motives, and the events of Valentine's Day. The prosecution carefully constructed a timeline. First came the financial pressure, then the growing marital tension, then the alleged effort to obtain fentanyl, then the failed Valentine's Day poisoning, then the fatal Moscow Mule, then the insurance issues, then the children's book. Individually, each piece of evidence could be debated. Together, prosecutors argued, they formed a clear picture. The defense disagreed. They argued that prosecutors were taking unrelated events and forcing them into a narrative. They reminded jurors that suspicion is not proof. They argued that tragic coincidences can happen, and they insisted that Kouri Richins was not a murderer. As closing arguments approached, the stakes could not have been higher. At the center of the case stood three young boys, three children who had already lost their father. and who now faced the possibility of losing their mother as well. The emotional weight of the trial hung over every day of proceedings, but ultimately, jurors were not asked to decide what outcome would be least painful. They were asked to determine what the evidence proved. When deliberations finally began, many expected a lengthy process. The case had attracted national attention. The evidence was extensive. The charges were serious. Yet the jury's decision came faster than many observers anticipated. After only a few hours of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Guilty. Guilty of aggravated murder. Guilty of attempted aggravated murder relating to the earlier poisoning incident. Guilty of insurance fraud. Guilty of forgery. The courtroom fell silent. For prosecutors, the verdict represented confirmation of everything they had argued. For the defense, it marked a devastating defeat. For Kouri Richins' family, it brought a measure of accountability, but it could never bring Eric back. The verdict transformed Kouri Richins from a grieving widow into a convicted murderer. Yet one crucial stage remained: sentencing, and the decision that followed would determine whether she would ever walk free again. Sentencing hearings often reveal the deepest emotions in a criminal case. This hearing was no exception. The court considered the impact of Eric's death, the circumstances of the crime, the effect on surviving family members, and the future of the couple's 3 sons. The judge faced an extraordinary decision. Under Utah law, there were 2 primary options for the most serious conviction: a sentence that could eventually allow parole, or life without parole. The difference between those outcomes was enormous. One possibility offered a chance, however distant, of future release. The other effectively guaranteed death in prison. Before imposing sentence, the judge carefully reviewed the evidence and findings of the trial. He discussed the seriousness of the offense. He discussed the impact on Eric's family. He discussed the suffering caused by the crime. Most importantly, he discussed the sequence of events. The judge noted that according to the jury's findings, there had been an earlier failed attempt to kill Eric. Opportunity existed to stop. Opportunity existed to walk away. Opportunity existed to choose a different path. Instead, according to the verdict, the effort continued, and Eric died. For the judge, this was a critical factor, because it suggested determination rather than impulse, planning rather than panic, calculation rather than emotion. Then came the final decision: life without parole, the harshest punishment available. The judge concluded that Kouri Richins was simply too dangerous to be released back into society. With those words, the legal process reached its most dramatic moment. A woman who had once appeared on television discussing grief and healing would now spend the rest of her life in prison. The contrast was extraordinary. One image showed a mother promoting a children's book about loss. The other showed a convicted murderer receiving a life sentence. Both images belonged to the same person. For many observers, that contrast remains the most haunting aspect of the entire case, because this was not a murder committed in an alleyway, not a robbery gone wrong, not a confrontation between strangers. It was a crime that prosecutors said emerged from within a marriage, from within a family, from within a home. A crime allegedly carried out by someone trusted completely by the victim. And that trust may have been the very thing that made the crime possible. Kouri Richins accepted a drink from his wife. A simple act repeated millions of times every day in households around the world. I had no reason to believe it would be his last. That fact continues to resonate far beyond Utah, because the case touches on one of the deepest fears people have. The fear that danger may not come from strangers. It may come from those closest to us. Today, Kouri Richins continues to maintain her innocence and retains the right to pursue appeals. Her legal battle may continue for years. Future courts may review arguments. Lawyers may challenge aspects of the conviction. But as things stand today, the verdict remains unchanged. Kouri Richins was determined to have been murdered, and Kouri Richins was determined to be responsible. For Eric's family, no verdict can truly repair the damage. 3 boys lost their father. Family lost a son. Friends lost someone they loved. And a life that should have stretched decades into the future ended in a bedroom in March 2022. The case began with a mysterious death. It evolved into a fentanyl poisoning investigation. It became a national media story. And it ended with a sentence of life without parole. Yet perhaps the most unsettling question remains unanswered. How much can we really know about the people closest to us? Because according to prosecutors, behind the image of a grieving widow stood a very different reality. reality hidden beneath public appearances, hidden beneath interviews, hidden beneath sympathy, hidden even beneath the children's book about loss. In the end, the death of Kouri Richins became more than a murder case. It became a story about trust, about greed, about deception, and about the devastating consequences that follow when the person you trust most becomes the person you should fear most.